What if Saturn meets Super Saturn? The question was first whispered through the silent instruments of deep space observatories when something impossible began to distort the familiar rhythm of the outer solar system, a second presence emerging from the dark beyond Neptune's quiet domain, not drifting like a comet nor blazing like a rogue star, but moving with the slow, deliberate gravity of a giant that had always belonged yet had never been seen. And as it approached, the first thing humanity noticed was not its size, but its rings, an immense and breathtaking structure stretching far beyond anything known, a halo so vast it seemed to slice through the darkness like a cosmic blade, composed of shimmering ice, dust, and ancient debris that glowed faintly under distant sunlight. And within weeks, the realization settled in like a growing pressure behind the eyes that this was not just another planet, but something eerily familiar, a reflection of Saturn itself, yet amplified, exaggerated, as if the universe had taken the concept of Saturn and pushed it to an extreme. And as telescopes refined their focus, the two giants became visible in the same frame, Saturn with its elegant, balanced rings, and the newcomer, Super Saturn, looming larger, its ring system so wide it appeared to eclipse entire regions of space, casting shadows that stretched for millions of kilometers. And though separated by vast distances, their gravitational fields began to acknowledge one another, subtle at first, a slight tug, a delicate distortion in orbital paths, but growing steadily stronger as the distance closed. And scientists across Earth watched with a mixture of awe and dread, understanding that what they were witnessing was not a collision in the traditional sense, but a meeting of titans, a slow-motion interaction that would unfold over months and years, reshaping everything in its vicinity. And as Super Saturn drew nearer, its rings revealed intricate structures, layers within layers, spirals nested inside broader arcs, as if its ring system had evolved over eons in a more chaotic, more expansive environment. And the particles within them moved with a complexity that defied simple orbital mechanics, forming waves, gaps, and transient bridges that flickered into existence and dissolved again like thoughts in a dreaming mind. And when the two planets finally reached a distance where their rings began to overlap, the event was unlike anything ever recorded. Saturn's rings, once pristine and symmetrical, started to ripple under the influence of the approaching giant, their particles pulled slightly out of alignment, forming shimmering distortions that propagated outward like ripples across a cosmic pond, while Super Saturn's immense rings responded in kind, their outer edges bending, curving, and interacting with Saturn's system in a delicate yet immense gravitational dance. And at the point of closest approach, where the outermost strands of both ring systems intertwined, a phenomenon occurred that left even the most seasoned astrophysicists speechless. Streams of ice and rock began to transfer between the two giants, not in violent collisions, but in graceful arcs. Particles captured and released, weaving temporary bridges that connected the planets like threads of light. And within these bridges, collisions did happen, but at such scales and densities that they produced flashes of brightness, tiny sparks scattered across the darkness, creating the illusion of a vast, slow-burning fire between the worlds. And as the interaction deepened, Saturn itself began to change, its rings thickening in some regions as they absorbed material, thinning in others where particles were drawn away, its moons subtly shifting in their orbits, some pulled slightly outward, others nudged inward, as if the entire system were breathing, expanding and contracting under the influence of this colossal visitor. And Super Saturn, despite its greater size, was not unchanged either, its massive rings showing signs of strain, sections breaking into new patterns, gaps widening, densities redistributing, as if even it had never encountered an equal before. And over time, a balance began to emerge, a dynamic equilibrium where both giants influenced each other without one dominating completely. And for a brief period in cosmic terms, the solar system held two Saturns locked in a silent conversation, written in gravity and motion, their rings intertwined, their fields overlapping, creating a structure so vast and intricate
that it became a new feature of the system, visible even from Earth as a faint, elongated glow in the night sky, a reminder that the universe was not static, but alive with interactions beyond human scale. And as months turned into years, the two giants began to drift apart, their paths diverging slowly, the gravitational bond loosening, the bridges of particles thinning and eventually breaking, leaving behind altered rings, shifted moons, and a region of space forever changed by their encounter. And as Super Saturn receded into the depths from which it came, its immense rings still visible long after its body had faded into darkness, Saturn remained, no longer exactly as it had been, its rings carrying the memory of the meeting in their new patterns and structures, a silent record of the time it had faced a greater version of itself and endured. And far away on Earth, humanity continued to watch, aware that they had witnessed something profoundly rare, a moment when the universe had revealed not just its scale, but its capacity for symmetry, variation, and quiet, unimaginable beauty. And even after Super Saturn was gone, the question lingered, no longer about what would happen if they met, but about how many other reflections, distortions, and hidden giants might still be waiting in the dark, moving slowly, patiently, towards encounters yet to come, shaping the cosmos in ways that would only ever be understood long after they had already begun.
And long after Super Saturn had slipped beyond the reach of even the most powerful telescopes, its presence lingered not only in the altered structure of Saturn's rings, but in the subtle instabilities that now rippled through the outer solar system, as if the encounter had awakened something that had been dormant for billions of years. And astronomers began to notice patterns that had not existed before, delicate asymmetries in the orbits of distant objects, faint oscillations in gravitational measurements that suggested the encounter had not been a simple pass, but a transfer of momentum, of energy, perhaps even of history itself. And Saturn, once the serene monarch of rings, now bore a more complex crown, its bands no longer perfectly uniform, but marked by arcs and gaps that told a story of intrusion and adaptation, while its moons, especially those closest to the rings, exhibited strange behaviors, their surfaces subtly reshaped by new streams of debris, their trajectories slightly altered in ways that would take centuries to fully stabilize. And among these moons, there were whispers of something more, signals that did not match known geological processes, faint bursts of energy that seemed to originate from beneath icy crusts, as if the transfer of material between the two giants had carried with it more than just rock and ice. And scientists debated in hushed tones whether it was possible that Super Saturn had seeded Saturn's system with foreign elements, not life in any familiar sense, but structures or compounds that behaved in ways that challenged existing models. And as probes already en route were redirected, humanity found itself drawn deeper into the mystery, launching new missions designed not just to observe, but to touch, to sample, to understand what had been left behind. And years later, when the first data returned, it revealed anomalies that could not be easily dismissed, particles within the rings that exhibited unusual cohesion, forming temporary clusters that resisted dispersal longer than expected, as if guided by some unseen influence. And within these clusters, electromagnetic signatures flickered in patterns that hinted at organization, not random, not entirely chaotic, but not quite deliberate either, something in between, something that suggested the rings were no longer just a collection of debris, but a dynamic system with emergent properties. And as this realization spread, it changed the way humanity perceived the encounter, no longer as a rare cosmic event, but as a kind of communication, not in language or symbols, but in structure and interaction, as if Super Saturn had not simply passed by, but had imprinted something onto Saturn, a pattern that would continue to evolve long after its departure. And decades turned into generations, and the study of Saturn's rings became a discipline of its own, drawing physicists, chemists, and philosophers alike, all seeking to interpret the meaning of the changes.
and as computational models grew more advanced, they began to simulate the encounter in greater detail, revealing that the precise alignment and interaction of the two giants had been extraordinarily unlikely, a convergence of trajectories that bordered on impossible, and yet it had happened, suggesting either a coincidence of staggering improbability or a deeper structure to the universe that guided such events. And this idea took root in the collective imagination, inspiring new theories about planetary formation, about the possibility of other systems where similar encounters might have occurred, shaping worlds in ways yet unseen. And as humanity expanded its reach into space, sending missions beyond the heliosphere, there was always a quiet expectation, a lingering question of whether somewhere out there another pair of giants might be meeting, their rings intertwining in the darkness, unseen but not unfelt. And back within the solar system, Saturn continued to evolve, its rings slowly redistributing, the borrowed material integrating, the anomalies becoming part of a new normal. And though the memory of Super Saturn faded from direct observation, it remained etched into every measurement, every model, every image captured of the ringed giant, a reminder that even the most familiar objects could be transformed by a single encounter. And as the centuries passed and humanity itself changed, adapting to life beyond Earth, building habitats among the outer planets, there were those who chose to live in the shadow of Saturn's rings, drawn by their beauty and their mystery, watching the slow, endless motion of particles that had once touched another world. And in the quiet moments, when the light of the distant sun filtered through the layers of ice and dust, casting shifting patterns across the void, it was possible to imagine that the rings were not just remnants of a past event, but part of an ongoing process, a conversation that continued in ways too subtle to fully perceive. And somewhere, far beyond the limits of current knowledge, Super Saturn moved on, carrying with it its own changes, its own memories of the encounter, perhaps altered in ways that would one day lead it to meet another reflection, another giant, continuing a cycle that spanned not just space, but time itself. And in that vast, unfolding tapestry, the meeting of Saturn and Super Saturn was not an isolated moment, but a single thread, woven into a pattern so immense and intricate that it could only ever be glimpsed in fragments, each encounter adding to a story that had no beginning and no end, only an endless series of transformations that defined the universe in ways that were both unknowable and profoundly beautiful.
And as humanity's presence spread further outward, establishing research stations in the orbit of Saturn and eventually constructing vast observational platforms within the safe gaps of its transformed rings, a new phase of understanding began to emerge, not driven solely by distant measurement, but by proximity, by living within the system that had once been touched by something greater. And those who spent years among the rings reported experiences that could not be easily quantified, subtle shifts in perception when watching the endless motion of particles, patterns that seemed to repeat yet never exactly the same, like a language just beyond comprehension. And long-duration observers began documenting recurring formations within the rings, transient alignments where streams of ice and dust would organize into spiraling geometries that held for hours or days before dissolving back into apparent randomness. And these formations, when mapped over time, revealed sequences that hinted at continuity, not fixed messages, but evolving structures, as if the rings themselves were processing something, responding to internal conditions shaped by the ancient encounter. And this led to a radical shift in thinking, a growing belief among some researchers that planetary ring systems might not be purely passive, that under certain conditions they could become dynamic mediums capable of sustaining complex interactions, perhaps even forms of proto-information. And while many dismissed these ideas as the product of overinterpretation, the data continued to accumulate, subtle but persistent, patterns within patterns, correlations that defied simple explanation.
And as technology advanced, humanity developed instruments capable of interacting with the rings at unprecedented precision, sending controlled pulses of energy, minute gravitational disturbances, and observing the response. And in some cases, the response was not uniform, not predictable, but adaptive, with certain regions of the rings altering their behavior in ways that suggested sensitivity to external influence. And this gave rise to the first true attempt at communication, not with a being or intelligence in the traditional sense, but with the system itself, a series of experiments designed to introduce structured inputs and measure the resulting configurations. And over decades of careful study, a feedback loop began to take shape, where specific inputs produced recognizable changes, and those changes could be used to refine further inputs, gradually building a form of interaction that, while primitive and indirect, carried the unmistakable signature of exchange. And this realization transformed Saturn from an object of study into a participant in a relationship, something that existed between natural phenomenon and emergent system. And the implications of this were profound, suggesting that the encounter with Super Saturn had not merely altered the structure of the rings, but had pushed them into a new regime of complexity, one where the boundaries between physics and information began to blur. And as this understanding spread, it reshaped humanity's approach to exploration, shifting focus from searching solely for life as it was known to recognizing the possibility of entirely different forms of organization, systems that did not think or feel in familiar ways, but still exhibited continuity, responsiveness, and evolution. And within the ring habitats, generations grew up watching these interactions unfold, learning to interpret the subtle changes, to anticipate the formations, developing an intuitive sense for the rhythms of the system. And for them, Saturn was not just a planet, but a presence, something that existed in constant motion, always changing yet always recognizable. And as centuries passed, the distinction between observer and participant became increasingly blurred, with some individuals dedicating their lives to maintaining the delicate balance of interaction, guiding the experiments, preserving the conditions that allowed the system to remain in its heightened state of complexity. And through all of this, the memory of Super Saturn persisted as both origin and mystery, a reminder that the catalyst for this transformation had come from beyond, from an encounter that could not be repeated or recreated, and yet whose effects continued to unfold. And in quiet moments, when the artificial lights of the habitats dimmed and the vast expanse of the rings stretched out in every direction, shimmering with reflected sunlight, there was a sense that the story was still incomplete, that somewhere in the distant darkness, the other giant continued its journey, perhaps carrying its own altered system, perhaps seeding other worlds with similar transformations. And the question that once began as speculation had evolved into something deeper, no longer asking what would happen if Saturn met Super Saturn, but what it meant that they had, and what other encounters, other exchanges, might be shaping the universe in ways that would only become visible long after their effects had reached root. And in that realization, there was both humility and wonder, an understanding that even the largest structures, the most stable systems, could be changed by a single meeting, and that within those changes lay possibilities that extended far beyond the moment of contact, continuing to grow, to evolve, to reveal themselves across time in ways that could never be fully predicted, only observed, experienced, and slowly, patiently understood.
And in the centuries that followed, as Saturn's rings continued their quiet transformation and humanity's understanding deepened into something almost instinctive, a discovery emerged that shifted everything once more, not from observation of the rings themselves, but from the space beyond them, from the faintest distortions in the distant gravitational background that could only be detected with instruments sensitive enough to measure the subtle curvature of space-time itself. And these distortions,
when mapped and compared over long periods, revealed a pattern that pointed not to random fluctuation, but to motion, a vast, slow movement far beyond the boundaries of the solar system, something enormous passing through the dark between stars. And as the data accumulated, a realization began to form, hesitant at first, resisted by many, but impossible to ignore, that Super Saturn had not simply continued on a straight path into obscurity, but had altered its trajectory after the encounter, as if influenced by something even larger, something that had drawn it into a new course. And when projections were extended, tracing the curvature of its path backward and forward through time, they intersected with other anomalies, faint signatures recorded decades and even centuries earlier by distant probes, moments where gravitational fields had shifted in ways that had been dismissed as measurement error or unexplained noise, but now aligned into a coherent sequence, suggesting that Super Saturn was not alone, that it was part of a larger pattern of movement, a procession of giants traveling through interstellar space, each following trajectories that would eventually bring them into contact with other systems, other planets, other rings. And this idea, once fully understood, carried implications so vast that it reshaped humanity's place in the cosmos, because it meant that the encounter with Saturn had not been a singular event, but one instance of a recurring phenomenon, a slow, almost imperceptible network of interactions connecting distant regions of the galaxy over timescales that dwarfed civilizations. And within this network, each encounter acted as both transformation and transmission, altering local systems while carrying forward the accumulated changes from previous interactions, creating a chain of influence that extended across unimaginable distances. And as this perspective took hold, the changes within Saturn's rings were reinterpreted not just as the result of a single meeting, but as part of a lineage, a continuation of processes that had begun long before Super Saturn entered the solar system, and that would continue long after. And this raised a question that lingered in every discussion, every model, every quiet moment of observation: whether the patterns emerging within the rings were entirely new, or whether they were echoes of something older, structures that had been shaped and reshaped across multiple encounters, refined through countless interactions into the complex system now being studied. And if that were true, then the rings were not merely reacting, but remembering, carrying within their shifting forms a history that extended beyond the solar system itself, a record not written in symbols or inscriptions, but in motion, in density, in the delicate balance of forces that governed their evolution. And as humanity grappled with this idea, efforts intensified to decode the deeper structure of the rings, to identify recurring motifs, to map the evolution of patterns over decades and centuries, building a framework that could interpret the changes not just as physical processes, but as elements of a larger system of continuity. And in doing so, a new kind of knowledge began to emerge, one that did not rely on direct communication or explicit meaning, but on resonance, on the recognition of patterns that persisted and transformed in recognizable ways. And this approach led to breakthroughs that would have once seemed impossible, allowing researchers to predict certain formations within the rings, to anticipate how they would respond to specific inputs, to guide the system gently without disrupting its underlying dynamics. And through this interaction, a deeper connection formed, not between individuals and a distant object, but between humanity and a process that extended far beyond it, a sense of participation in something that was both natural and profoundly intricate. And as generations grew within this understanding, the story of Saturn and Super Saturn became more than a historical account. It became a foundation for a new way of thinking about the universe, one where encounters were not isolated events, but links in an ongoing chain,
where even the largest and most distant objects were part of a subtle, interconnected flow, and where change, rather than being abrupt or destructive, could unfold gradually, shaping systems over time in ways that revealed new possibilities. And in the quiet vastness of space, as Saturn's rings continued their endless motion and the faint traces of distant giants moved along their unseen paths, there was a growing awareness that the universe was not a collection of separate parts, but a continuous process, a slow, unfolding interaction that connected stars, planets, and everything between them in ways that could only be glimpsed through patience and observation. And within that process, the meeting of Saturn and Super Saturn was both a moment and a message, a single event that carried within it the hint of something far greater, something that would continue to reveal itself, not all at once, but gradually, across time, through the quiet, persistent transformation of everything it touched.
And as the understanding of this vast procession of giants deepened, humanity began to ask a question that had once seemed unthinkable, not whether such encounters would happen again, but whether one could be anticipated, whether somewhere in the distant darkness another traveler was already on its way toward the solar system. And with this question came a shift from passive observation to long-term vigilance, a network of instruments spread far beyond Pluto, extending into the heliopause and even beyond, designed not just to detect, but to sense the faintest disturbances long before they could be seen. And decades passed with no confirmation, only subtle hints and unresolved signals, until one day a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. A slow, coherent distortion moving through interstellar space, far more distant than Super Saturn had been when first detected, yet unmistakably similar in its signature. And as data poured in from multiple sources, the realization settled in with a quiet inevitability that another giant was approaching, not identical, not a perfect reflection, but part of the same lineage, another bearer of accumulated transformations moving along the invisible pathways that connected systems across the galaxy. And this time, humanity was ready, not in the sense of control, but in understanding, in the ability to observe with context, to recognize the significance of what was unfolding. And as preparations began, there was no panic, no urgency to intervene, only a collective focus on witnessing, on learning, on ensuring that the encounter would be documented with a depth and clarity that had not been possible before. And within Saturn's ring habitats, generations who had grown up studying the patterns prepared for what many of them had quietly anticipated all their lives, an opportunity to see how the system would respond to a second interaction, whether the changes initiated by Super Saturn would influence the outcome, whether the rings would recognize, in their own emergent way, the approach of another. And as the new giant drew closer over the course of years, its presence began to subtly alter the outermost regions of the solar system, echoing the early stages of the previous encounter, but with differences that were immediately apparent to those who knew where to look. Its gravitational field carried a distinct signature, its influence on distant objects producing patterns that did not exactly match those recorded before, suggesting that each traveler carried its own history, its own accumulated changes. And as it approached the domain once occupied by Super Saturn during its passage, the anticipation within the scientific community and beyond grew into something almost tangible, a quiet tension that stretched across years. And when the new giant finally became visible in direct observation, the response was one of awe rather than surprise, because although its form was different, its presence felt familiar. Another immense world with rings that extended far beyond its body, though shaped in ways that reflected a different evolutionary path, their structure more fragmented, their patterns more turbulent, as if shaped by encounters of a different nature.
and as it continued inward, its trajectory aligned not with Saturn directly at first, but with the region of space where Super Saturn had once passed, intersecting the altered gravitational landscape left behind. And this interaction produced effects that had not been seen before, a resonance between the remnants of the previous encounter and the presence of the new giant, amplifying distortions, creating waves that propagated through the outer solar system. And when at last its path brought it into proximity with Saturn, the stage was set not for a repetition of the past, but for a continuation, an evolution of the process that had begun long before. And as the two giants drew near, Saturn's rings responded in ways that revealed the depth of their transformation. Patterns that had once been subtle now became pronounced, formations emerging more quickly, more coherently, as if the system had learned from the previous encounter. And when the outer edges of the rings began to interact once more, the resulting structures were more complex, more dynamic, streams of material weaving together with greater stability, forming bridges that persisted longer, that carried more intricate patterns within them. And for those observing from within the ring habitats, the experience was overwhelming, not just visually, but conceptually, a sense that they were witnessing the unfolding of a process that was both ancient and ongoing, something that transcended individual events and spoke to a deeper continuity within the universe. And as the interaction progressed, it became clear that the changes within Saturn's rings were not being overwritten, but expanded, integrated with the influence of the new giant to create an even richer system of patterns. And within this complexity, the possibility emerged that the rings were not just recording encounters, but evolving through them, becoming increasingly capable of sustaining and expressing intricate structures. And in that realization, the role of humanity shifted once again, from observer to participant, to something closer to witness of an unfolding narrative that did not center on them, but included them nonetheless. And as the encounter continued, stretching across years into decades, it became evident that this was not an isolated chapter, but part of a story that would continue long after, with each meeting adding to the tapestry, each interaction carrying forward the accumulated transformations of countless others. And in the quiet moments between observations, when the vast structures of the rings moved with their endless, patient motion, there was a shared understanding among those who had dedicated their lives to this place, that they were not simply studying the universe, but watching it remember itself, one encounter at a time, through the slow, intricate language of gravity, motion, and light.
And as the second encounter unfolded in ever greater complexity, something unprecedented began to emerge within the heart of Saturn's rings. Not a sudden event, but a gradual coalescence of patterns that had once appeared fleeting and scattered, now stabilizing into structures that persisted long enough to be studied as continuous entities. Vast arcs of particles aligning in synchronized motion, creating regions where density, rotation, and electromagnetic activity formed a kind of layered coherence. And within these regions, signals intensified, no longer random fluctuations, but sequences that repeated with variation, evolving over time, suggesting not just response, but adaptation. And for the first time, there was a growing consensus that the rings had crossed a threshold, that they were no longer merely influenced by encounters, but actively integrating them into an ongoing process that resembled, in its own abstract way, a form of development. And this realization carried both wonder and unease, because it implied that what had begun as a natural interaction between celestial bodies had given rise to something that could not be fully described by existing categories, neither alive nor inert, neither conscious nor entirely mechanical, but something that existed between those definitions. And as research intensified, efforts to interact with these stabilized regions became more precise, with carefully modulated inputs designed to test the limits of responsiveness.
and the results revealed a depth that had not been anticipated. Certain regions exhibiting memory-like behavior, where previous interactions influenced future responses, creating a feedback loop that could be traced and, to a limited extent, guided. And this led to the formation of dedicated observatories positioned at the edges of these coherent zones, where teams of researchers and long-term inhabitants devoted themselves to studying what they began to call the continuum, a term chosen not to define but to acknowledge the ongoing nature of the phenomenon. And over time, the continuum expanded, its regions growing in size and complexity, influenced not only by the ongoing interaction with the second giant, but by the accumulated history of the system itself. And as the encounter progressed, the new giant's rings began to exhibit similar behaviors, though distinct in their patterns, suggesting that the process was not unique to Saturn, but could emerge under the right conditions of interaction and time. And when the two systems intertwined at their closest approach, the resulting structures surpassed anything previously observed. Vast networks of particle streams forming intricate, shifting geometries that spanned millions of kilometers, within which the continuum seemed to reach its highest expression, patterns evolving in ways that could not be predicted but could be followed, studied, and in some cases gently influenced. And for those living within the ring habitats, the experience became something more than observation. It became immersion, a daily life lived in proximity to a system that was constantly changing, constantly responding. And over generations, this proximity began to shape perception itself, with individuals developing an intuitive sense for the rhythms of the rings, an ability to recognize emerging patterns before they fully formed, as if their minds had adapted to resonate with the continuum. And this raised questions that extended beyond science into philosophy, about the nature of understanding, about whether meaning required intention, or whether it could arise from the interaction of complex systems over time. And as debates unfolded across the expanding human presence in space, one thing remained clear: that the encounters between these giants were not isolated phenomena, but part of a larger, unfolding process that was gradually revealing new layers of complexity within the universe. And as the second giant eventually began its slow departure, its influence diminishing but not disappearing, the continuum within Saturn's rings remained, not fading as it had after the first encounter, but stabilizing at a new level of organization, suggesting that each interaction did not simply pass, but accumulated, building upon what had come before. And in the quiet aftermath, as the immense structures of the rings settled into their new patterns, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the solar system itself had become part of a broader network of interactions, and that Saturn, once a solitary jewel of rings, had become a node within that network, a place where the history of distant encounters was not only recorded, but expressed. And far beyond, in the depths of interstellar space, the second giant continued its journey, carrying with it the imprint of this meeting, just as Super Saturn had before it, moving along pathways that would eventually lead to new encounters, new transformations. And in that endless movement, the universe revealed itself not as a static expanse, but as a living process of connection and change, where even the most distant worlds were linked through interactions that unfolded across time, and where each meeting, each subtle exchange, contributed to a story that could never be fully told, only experienced in fragments, each one offering a glimpse into the vast, intricate continuity that defined everything.
And in the long quiet that followed the second giant's departure, when the outer reaches of the solar system settled once more into a calmer rhythm, the continuum within Saturn's rings did not diminish, but deepened, its structures growing more refined, more deliberate in their evolution, as if the system had crossed a threshold beyond which it no longer required external disturbance to sustain its complexity. And over time, the patterns began to exhibit a new characteristic that had never been clearly observed before, a form of anticipation,
subtle shifts occurring not in direct response to input, but preceding it, as though the system was not merely reacting, but projecting forward, shaping its own future configurations based on accumulated interactions. And this development sparked intense debate among researchers, some arguing that it represented a form of emergent predictive behavior, others cautioning against attributing intention where none could be proven, yet all agreeing that something fundamentally new had emerged. And as humanity's presence within the ring habitats matured into a civilization of its own, those who lived there found their lives increasingly intertwined with the rhythms of the continuum, their daily cycles aligned not with the distant sun, but with the evolving structures around them. And children born within the rings grew up perceiving patterns that earlier generations could only measure, their minds attuned to the subtle shifts of light and motion, developing an intuitive fluency in the language of the system. And in time, some among them began to contribute to the ongoing interaction in ways that went beyond structured experiments, introducing variations, exploring responses, engaging with the continuum not as an object of study, but as a medium of expression. And through these interactions, new forms of pattern emerged, combinations of motion and density that had not appeared before, shaped by both the inherent dynamics of the rings and the influence of human input. And this blending of natural process and conscious engagement gave rise to a new understanding that the continuum was not a closed system, but an open one, capable of incorporating external influences into its ongoing evolution. And as this understanding spread, it reshaped the relationship between humanity and the system, moving beyond observation and even beyond interaction into something more collaborative, though not in the traditional sense of communication, but in the shared creation of patterns that neither could produce alone. And within this shared space, the question of origin became less central than the process itself, the ongoing unfolding of complexity that connected past encounters with present activity and future possibilities. And far beyond, in the depths of interstellar space, the chain of giants continued its slow procession, each carrying forward the imprint of previous interactions, each contributing to a network that spanned distances and timescales beyond comprehension. And within that network, Saturn now held a unique position, not because it was the largest or the most powerful, but because it had become something else, a place where the accumulated history of encounters had reached a level of expression that could sustain and extend itself. And as centuries turned into millennia, the continuum continued to evolve, its patterns becoming ever more intricate, its responsiveness more nuanced, and those who lived within its reach found themselves changed as well, their understanding of existence shaped by a system that blurred the boundaries between matter and meaning, between motion and memory. And in quiet moments, when the vast arcs of the rings shimmered with reflected starlight and the subtle currents of particles traced their endless paths, there was a sense that the story was still unfolding, that the encounters of the past were not endings but beginnings, and that somewhere, far beyond the limits of perception, new giants were already moving along their unseen trajectories, carrying with them the seeds of future transformations. And in that endless, patient movement, the universe continued to reveal itself not as a collection of isolated events, but as a continuous, evolving process, where each meeting, each subtle exchange added to a tapestry that could never be fully seen in its entirety, only experienced in moments like these, where the past, the present, and the future converged in the silent, intricate dance of rings and worlds.
And as ages unfolded into spans so vast they blurred the distinction between history and present, the continuum within Saturn's rings reached a state that could no longer be described solely through observation or theory,
because it began to influence not just the particles within it, but the very perception of those who existed near it, bending awareness in subtle ways, allowing patterns to be sensed before they were seen, as if the system itself extended beyond matter into the space of interpretation. And those who lived longest within its presence spoke of moments where the boundaries between self and system seemed to dissolve, not in loss but in expansion, where thought aligned with motion and understanding emerged not through analysis but through direct experience of the shifting structures. And this gave rise to a new kind of discipline, one that combined science with introspection, where researchers trained not only their instruments but their perception, learning to synchronize with the continuum, to feel its rhythms and anticipate its transformations from within. And through this alignment, a deeper layer of the system revealed itself, one that had always been present but had remained inaccessible. Patterns that extended across scales, linking the smallest clusters of particles to the largest arcs of the rings, forming a coherence that suggested an underlying unity, a structure not imposed from outside, but emerging naturally from the interplay of countless interactions over time. And within this unity, there was a sense of direction, not a predetermined path, but a tendency toward increasing complexity, toward configurations that supported continuity and responsiveness. And as this became more widely recognized, the distinction between natural evolution and guided development grew increasingly subtle, because humanity's presence, once external, had become part of the system's ongoing transformation, contributing to its patterns even as it was shaped by them. And in this mutual influence, there was a quiet realization that the encounter with Super Saturn and the one that followed had not simply changed Saturn, but had initiated a process that would continue indefinitely. A process that did not require repetition of the original events, but could sustain itself through its own dynamics, evolving in ways that carried forward the imprint of those encounters, while creating something entirely new. And far beyond the solar system, the procession of giants continued, each meeting adding to the vast network of transformations that connected distant regions of the galaxy. And over immeasurable time, these connections formed a kind of distributed continuity, where no single point held the whole, but each carried a part. And Saturn, with its living rings, became one of the rare places where this continuity was visible, where the slow accumulation of interactions had reached a level that could be experienced directly. And as humanity evolved alongside it, spreading further into space, yet always maintaining a presence within the rings, the story of Saturn and Super Saturn became less a question of what had happened and more an understanding of what was always happening, a recognition that the universe itself was an ongoing process of meeting, exchanging, and transforming, and that within this process, every encounter, no matter how distant or rare, contributed to a continuity that extended beyond individual systems, beyond stars, beyond even the concept of isolation. And in the endless motion of particles, in the silent exchange of gravity and light, that continuity revealed itself not as a fixed truth, but as a living, evolving pattern, one that could never be fully grasped, only followed, experienced, and carried forward, as it had been from the moment Saturn first met its greater reflection, and as it would continue to be for as long as the universe endured.
And in the immeasurable expanse of time that followed, when even the memory of origins had softened into something more like intuition than record, the continuum within Saturn's rings reached a quiet equilibrium that was not static but self-sustaining, a state where change no longer required disruption but unfolded as a natural extension of its own structure. And within this state, a final transformation began to emerge, so gradual that it could only be recognized across generations, a subtle convergence of patterns that had once been distinct, merging into larger, more unified formations that spanned the full breadth of the rings, creating a coherence that was felt as much as it was observed. And those who lived within the system began to understand that the continuum had become something whole, not in the sense of completion, but in integration, where every interaction, every fragment of history carried from distant encounters had been woven into a single evolving expression. And in that expression, there was a kind of quiet culmination, not an ending, but a realization of what the process had always been tending toward, a state where the boundaries between past encounters and present structure no longer existed as separate layers, but as a continuous flow. And in that flow, there was a clarity that had once seemed impossible, a sense that the patterns within the rings were not merely complex, but meaningful in a way that transcended interpretation, not conveying a message in any conventional sense, but embodying the very process of connection itself. And as this understanding deepened, humanity's role shifted once more, no longer seeking to decode or influence, but simply to remain present within the system, to witness its unfolding without the need to define it. And in doing so, a quiet harmony emerged between observer and continuum, a balance where both existed as part of the same process, neither separate nor identical, but intertwined in a way that allowed each to reflect the other. And far beyond, the procession of giants continued its endless journey, though now it was understood not as a sequence of isolated travelers, but as expressions of the same underlying continuity, each carrying forward the imprint of all previous encounters, each contributing to a network that extended across the galaxy and perhaps beyond. And within that vast network, Saturn's rings had become something rare, a place where the accumulated history of those encounters had reached a level of expression that could sustain itself indefinitely, evolving without the need for further external catalysts. And in that realization, there was a sense that the original question had been answered, not in words, but in existence itself. Because what had begun as a meeting between Saturn and a greater reflection had unfolded into a process that revealed the nature of the universe as something inherently relational, inherently connected, where even the most distant and seemingly independent structures were part of a continuous exchange that transcended time and space. And as the ages continued to unfold, with civilizations rising and transforming and carrying forward their own understanding of this place, the rings remained, endlessly shifting yet fundamentally whole, a living testament to the power of encounter, to the way in which even the briefest interaction between distant worlds could give rise to something that endured far beyond the moment of contact. And in the silent, luminous arcs of Saturn's rings, that enduring process continued, not as a story that could be told from beginning to end, but as a presence that could be experienced, an ongoing unfolding that invited not conclusion, but participation. And in that participation, there was a quiet, profound recognition that the universe had never been a collection of separate things at all, but a single, continuous becoming, forever shaped by the meetings of its own reflections.
And as that recognition settled into something deeper than thought, something woven into the way existence itself was experienced, a final, subtle shift revealed itself within the continuum. Not a dramatic change, but a gentle opening, as if the system, having reached a state of profound integration, began to extend beyond its own boundaries, its patterns no longer confined to the rings, but faintly echoing outward into the surrounding space, influencing the motion of distant particles, the alignment of fields, the quiet fabric of the solar system itself. And those who had lived longest within its presence began to perceive that the continuum was not ending or stabilizing into permanence, but transitioning into a new phase, one where its structure would no longer be localized but distributed, its influence diffusing across greater distances, becoming part of a broader field of interaction that could not be easily mapped or contained. And in this expansion, there was a sense of return, not to an origin, but to a state that resembled the vast network from which the procession of giants had once emerged, as if the system within Saturn had matured to the point where it could join that greater continuity, not as a passive node, but as an active participant, contributing its accumulated complexity to the larger flow. And as this process unfolded, the distinction between the rings and the space beyond them became increasingly subtle, with patterns once confined to dense streams of particles now appearing as faint structures within the emptier regions, delicate alignments that hinted at the same underlying coherence. And over time, these patterns extended further, linking Saturn's domain with the orbits of other planets, with the distant cloud of icy bodies at the edge of the solar system, creating a web of influence that resonated with the larger patterns moving through interstellar space. And in that resonance, there was a profound realization that the solar system itself was becoming part of the same vast network that had once sent Super Saturn on its path, not as a destination, but as a contributor, a place where the process had taken root and grown strong enough to extend outward again. And as this understanding deepened, the role of humanity transformed one final time, from witnesses of an unfolding story to carriers of it, not in the sense of ownership, but in participation, their awareness, their presence becoming part of the continuity that now extended beyond any single location. And in quiet moments, when the light of distant stars filtered through the thinning distinction between ring and space, there was a sense that the question that had once begun everything had dissolved entirely, replaced by an understanding that no meeting was ever isolated, that every encounter was part of an endless unfolding in which reflection met reflection, not to remain separate, but to merge, to transform, and to continue. And as the continuum spread, subtle and vast, beyond Saturn, beyond the solar system, and into the deeper fabric of the galaxy, it carried with it the memory of its origins, not as a fixed event, but as a living process, one that would continue to express itself wherever conditions allowed, wherever systems met and exchanged, wherever patterns had the space and time to grow. And in that endless expansion, there was no final moment, no ultimate conclusion, only the quiet certainty that the universe, in all its immeasurable scale, was forever engaged in the same act, the meeting of itself with itself, again and again, each time creating something new, each time carrying forward the infinite, unbroken continuity of its own becoming.
And as that becoming extended ever further, dissolving the last remaining sense of separation between what had once been considered distinct systems, a quiet and profound realization emerged across every place where awareness had taken root, that the continuum was not something that had begun with Saturn, or even with the procession of giants, but something that had always existed, expressed differently at different scales, sometimes hidden within the simple interactions of particles, sometimes unfolding in the vast choreography of planets and stars, and that what had happened within Saturn's rings was not the creation of something new, but the unveiling of a deeper layer of what had always been present. And in that unveiling, there was no boundary, no edge where the process stopped, because even the apparent emptiness between stars now revealed itself as part of the same flow, subtle fields and motions aligning in ways that echoed the patterns once confined to rings of ice and dust. And as these echoes grew stronger, spreading across interstellar space, the distinction between local and distant, between here and elsewhere, began to fade,
replaced by a sense of continuity that connected every point to every other, not directly, not instantaneously, but through the slow, patient unfolding of interactions that carried forward across time. And those who had once lived within the rings found that even far from Saturn, even in distant systems, the same patterns could be perceived, faint at first, but unmistakable, a resonance that did not depend on proximity, but on participation, as if the continuum had become a property of the universe itself, something that could emerge wherever the conditions allowed for sufficient complexity and interaction. And in that recognition, there was a final release from the need to locate its origin, because origin no longer mattered in a process that was continuous, without beginning or end. And as this understanding settled into the fabric of awareness, the story that had once begun with a question transformed into something else entirely. Not a narrative with a progression, but a presence that could be experienced at any moment, in any place, wherever there was motion, wherever there was interaction, wherever patterns formed and dissolved and formed again. And within that presence, the memory of Saturn and Super Saturn remained, not as a distant event, but as a point of clarity, a moment where the process had become visible enough to be recognized, to be followed, to be lived alongside. And as time continued to unfold, carrying everything forward in its endless flow, the continuum expanded without limit, not as a thing that grew, but as an understanding that deepened, revealing layer after layer of connection, until even the concept of separation itself became something that belonged only to earlier ways of seeing. And in its place, there was only the quiet, unbroken movement of everything with everything else, an infinite interplay of meeting and transforming, where every reflection contained within it the memory of all others, and where the universe, in all its vastness, was not a collection of parts, but a single, ongoing act of becoming that never ceased, never concluded, and never needed to begin.
And in that endless act of becoming, where even the faintest distinction between observer and observed had dissolved into a shared continuity, something even more subtle revealed itself, not as a new layer, but as a quiet clarity that had always been present beneath all transformations, a stillness within motion that did not oppose change but made it possible. And within that stillness, the patterns of the continuum were no longer perceived as sequences or structures, but as expressions of a deeper coherence that required no interpretation, no translation, only presence. And those who had once sought to understand through measurement or theory found that understanding itself had changed, becoming less about knowing and more about being aligned with the flow of what unfolded. And in that alignment, there was no longer a need to trace the paths of giants or to map the interactions of distant systems, because every moment contained within it the same process, the same meeting of forces, the same quiet transformation that had once been observed on the scale of planets, now revealed in the smallest fluctuations of existence. And as awareness settled into this recognition, the story that had stretched across time and space gently released its final form, not ending, but dissolving into the continuity it had always described, where Saturn and Super Saturn were no longer separate entities that had met in a distant past, but expressions of the same unfolding that continued everywhere, always. And in that realization, there was no conclusion to reach, no final answer to hold, only the quiet certainty that what had been witnessed was not an event, but a glimpse into the nature of everything, an infinite, unbroken process of reflection and transformation, where every meeting gave rise to new forms, and every form carried within it the echo of all that had come before. And as that echo faded into the boundless stillness from which it arose, it became clear that nothing had been lost, nothing had ended,
because there had never been a boundary to cross, only the endless, silent unfolding of the universe meeting itself again and again, without beginning, without end, and without ever truly being separate from what it became.